I never imagined my own son would try to destroy me in front of a church full of people. Everything looked so holy, soft lights glowing on the lilies lined along the aisle, the orchestra holding a bright note like glass, the crowd smiling as if love was floating in the air. For a moment, I let myself believe this day belonged to peace. Ruthie, my granddaughter, walked down the aisle in her white dress like a prayer come to life. She was radiant, her joy almost loud enough to drown all old sorrows. I watched her approach her father with pride swelling in my chest, thinking, let this be her moment. Let nothing ruin it. But peace is fragile, and it only takes one person to break it. The moment Ruthie leaned in to kiss her father, Evan turned, not toward her, but toward me. His face did not soften for his daughter, it hardened for his mother. His eyes narrowed like a blade being drawn, and before I could understand the shift, he spat. It struck my cheek with a heat that stung deeper than any slap could have. The sound of it echoed louder than the music. The entire church stopped breathing. The violinist froze mid-air. The pianist's hands hovered uselessly above the keys. Even God, I think, looked away. I did not lift my hand. I did not wipe my face. Some moments test your dignity, and mine told me not to move. If I lifted my hand, I would be admitting shame. If I reacted, I would be giving him victory. So I kept my palms folded in my lap like a woman carved from marble. Let the world look. Let them witness. Let them decide who truly disgraced this day. You had no right to be here, Evan said, his voice low enough to pretend control, but loud enough to humiliate me publicly. He spoke like a lawyer presenting evidence, as if the sin was not what he had done, but that I had dared to exist. I looked at him, not as a son, but as a stranger wearing my child's face. His jaw was tight. His pride stood taller than the cross behind him. He wanted me to bow. I would not. Ruthie's veil trembled as she turned toward me, confusion breaking through her joy. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice thin and shaking. Her hand, still lifted to bless her new beginning, curled slowly back to her chest. She didn't know whether to continue smiling for the cameras or collapse where she stood. The bridesmaids moved toward her with slow, careful steps, as if she had become something fragile, a porcelain bride in danger of cracking. Her eyes filled with tears, but they did not spill. Instead, she steadied herself like water settling after a stone is thrown. In that moment, I saw more strength in her than in the man who raised her. Father Benedict stood frozen at the altar. His lips parted, but no scripture came. For a moment, he simply bowed his head, as though even prayer had arrived too late. Then I noticed something the others didn't, a small ivory envelope resting beside the chalice. Neat, deliberate handwriting across it read, "Final payment, B.R." My mind captured it instantly, the way it always does with things that don't fit. I didn't know what it meant yet, but I knew it mattered. Then came the whispers. They moved through the pews like a breeze stirring reeds. What happened? Is that his mother? I thought they were close. Phones lifted in shaky hands, screens glowing like insects looking for carrion. I saw a boy already zooming in on my face. They didn't want the truth. They wanted the moment. I stood beneath the wedding arch like a portrait I had never agreed to pose for. Stained, displayed, silent, but not broken. I am Martha Hale, 68 years old, retired principal, widow of a kind man who left me steady, if not rich. I have survived school board politics, leaking roofs, and grief that wakes you at 4 a.m. I have held crying children and furious parents, and carried my patience like a lantern through darker halls than this one. Today, I held my composure because I had nothing else left to hold. "Mother," Evan said again, softer now, as if gentleness could rewrite what he had done. But cruelty whispered is still cruelty. You always find a way to make it about you. His voice trembled, not with remorse, but with the effort of holding his mask in place. He had always been skilled at that, showing the world the version of himself he wanted them to see, even when the frame cracked at the edges. I looked at him and thought, "My boy, what have you done to yourself?" "Let the ceremony continue," Father Benedict finally declared. His priestly tone returned, steadier now, though I could see the tension still in his jaw. The orchestra picked up its note again, not with grace, but with obedience. Ritual resumed like a machine forced back into motion. Ruthie looked at me once more, only once, and in that glance I saw apology, love, and a silent plea I did not yet know how to answer. I nodded because nodding is sometimes the only way to keep another person from collapsing. I moved to the last pew, not to hide, but to watch with full view of everything. Distance, I've learned, is not weakness, it is a strategy. The smell of old wood polish rose from the seat, reminding me of school halls and long mornings spent settling disputes with nothing but a calm voice and firm posture. I folded my silk gloves in my lap and pressed my hands flat against my knees to steady them. The vows began. Each promise sounded less like devotion and more like a test. For better or worse, in sickness and health, to love and to cherish. My cheeks still burned, my heart did not. When Ruthie's voice trembled on the words "for worse," I loved her more in that fragile moment than in all her perfect ones. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is walking through it with shaking steps. From where I sat, I could still see the altar, could still see the ivory envelope, quiet, waiting, like evidence untouched, final payment, BR. I repeated it silently until it engraved itself into my memory. I didn't fully understand it yet, but something inside me shifted. Not anger, not revenge. Something colder, sharper, steadier. The church settled back into motion, but the calm felt fake, like a smile that hurts to hold. Applause came and went in small nervous waves. I could hear the orchestra trying to smooth the air with pretty notes, but beauty can't hide a bruise. From the last pew, I watched every face turn careful, as if politeness were a blanket big enough to cover what had happened. It wasn't. I opened the program and saw the line near the back. Sponsored by Evan Hale and Partners, the gold letters shining like a small crown on his vanity. I traced the words with a steady finger, and then my eyes went back to the altar. The envelope was still there, ivory and quiet beside the chalice, the handwriting neat and certain. Final payment, BR. It sat like a secret waiting for someone to ask it a question. I kept my questions to myself and made a list in my head instead. I always make lists when the ground shifts. The vows ended, and the aisle filled with movement again. Photographer, planner, family in clusters. I stood when I needed to, sat when instructed, and let the tide pass me without pulling me under. The whispering began to carry across the room, light and sharp as dry leaves. "Is that his mother?" "She shouldn't have come." "I heard they fought." Phones came up like black mirrors, hunting proof. I faced forward and kept my mouth closed. Silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's a lever. The photographer called for families. I hovered at the edge of each frame until the planner, Elaine, kind eyes behind practiced calm, touched my elbow and steered me out. "We'll do one with you after the bouquet picture," she murmured, which was a mercy, even if it was a lie. Evan passed near me, the starch of his suit and the bite of champagne on his breath. "Don't make this about you," he said, as if repetition could turn blame into truth. I remembered the boy who once cried before a first sleepover and wanted, just for a fierce second, to take him home and teach him courage again. Ruthie slipped free of her circle and rested her head against my shoulder. "Thank you for the dress," she whispered, her voice damp with relief. I stiffened, not from offense, but surprise. "Who told you that?" I asked, and she said, "Dad, he said you paid for it through the church." A small bird of alarm beat its wings in my chest. I looked toward the altar and found Father Benedict's profile. He was staring at the envelope the way a man looks at a truth he wishes were kinder. A waiter delivered a folded note to Evan with the care of someone avoiding a storm. Evan glanced at it, tucked it away, and smiled for a passing guest. In that flick of paper, I caught a line of numbers I knew by muscle memory, my own check number to St. Mary's Benevolence Fund. For a breath, hope tempted me with a soft lie. Maybe this was a simple confusion that would settle with an explanation and a clean napkin. But hope is a poor detective. The facts did not change their shape. I stepped to the side aisle where the trellis roses held the last of the afternoon light. From there, I could see the altar more clearly, and the envelope waiting like a held breath. The room shifted toward the reception, doors opening, music brightening, relief trying to take the wheel. I let the crowd carry Evan away from me, his laughter traveling ahead of him like a sales pitch. I stood very still and decided on the one thing within my control. I would not chase what did not want me. I would wait for what was already walking my way. Then I felt a presence beside me. A warm hand, gentle, deliberate, touched my elbow. "Mrs. Hale," Father Benedict whispered, voice steady in a way mine wasn't yet. "Please stay till after the ceremony. For her sake." The vows began, and I sat alone in the last pew, the one meant for latecomers and ghosts. Ruthie's veil shimmered as it moved, rustling like the sound of a tide pulling back from shore. Every word Father Benedict spoke floated toward me through the hush. Soft, sacred syllables, trying to hold a family that was already breaking apart. From the back, I could see the tremor in Ruthie's bouquet, the way her fingers tightened, her heart trying to keep its rhythm. Someone behind me leaned to whisper, unaware that whispers travel better than truth. "Didn't she lose the house last year?" The words brushed against my ear like grit. I kept my eyes on the altar, but inside me, the memory of that sale burned bright. The porch light I left on for the last time, the echo of my husband's laugh fading from those walls. I smoothed the wedding program in my lap, trying to still the shake in my fingers. The heading glimmered, sponsored by Evan Hale and Partners. His name, bold and shining, the way he always wanted it. I smiled a small, practiced smile, the kind that says, yes, he's doing well, even when you know he isn't. The church air carried 3 distinct notes: the waxy sweetness of old wood polish, the faint echo of whispered prayers from the front rows, and the cool silk of my gloves folded perfectly across my lap. These were my anchors, small, sensory certainties in a sea of judgmental eyes. A tremor passed through me, not from shame, but recognition. 6 months earlier, I had sat in Evan's kitchen when Ruthie had announced her engagement. Her voice had trembled from joy then, not fear. "Grandma, I want you to help me pick the venue," she'd said, glowing like morning light. I had offered to contribute, not out of pity, but love. Evan's jaw had tightened before the words even formed. "We don't need your charity," he'd said, sharp, efficient, like cutting paper. The words had landed between us, and in that moment I had seen the boy who once cried over a broken toy but refused help glint through the man pretending to own the world. My small pension couldn't match his pride, but I had still hoped he'd let love be worth more than money. A few weeks later, I met Elaine Carter, the wedding planner, while bringing cookies to Ruthie's dress fitting. She had whispered to me as she adjusted a bouquet chart. "Between us, Mrs. Hale, he's behind on invoices, but don't quote me." Her voice was soft, cautious, not gossip, but warning. I had thanked her and pretended not to understand. We both knew that silence sometimes keeps a family standing. Back in the pew, Father Benedict's voice wrapped around the words for better or worse, and something in me cracked. I looked toward him and saw that ivory envelope again, the same one I had noticed earlier marked Final Payment, BR. It sat near the chalice, innocent, ordinary, but Benedict's eyes kept flicking toward it like a man guarding a confession. He hesitated during a pause in the vows, fingers brushing the edge of the envelope, then retreating. I wondered if it held a donation receipt, a letter, or something far heavier, the kind of truth that waits for its right moment to be known. When the vows ended, Applause rippled through the crowd like polite thunder. Ruthie smiled through tears, and Evan straightened his jacket, reclaiming his perfect composure. Guests rose, clapping, turning toward each other, already shifting from reverence to chatter. I stayed seated, letting the sound move past me like a wave I didn't need to ride. Father Benedict lingered behind the couple, adjusting his vestments. I saw his hand hover over the altar, over that small ivory envelope. Then, so slight it might have gone unnoticed, he slipped it into the inner pocket of his vest. Not to Evan, not to the coordinator, to himself. The crowd moved toward the exit, rice and ribbons and rehearsed smiles swirling together, but all I could see was that pocket and the faint outline of a secret pressing against his chest. I didn't know it yet, but that envelope would decide which of us walked away clean and which of us didn't. As Father Benedict turned to leave, he caught my eye just long enough for me to see it. A flicker of guilt, or maybe resolve. And for the first time that day, I realized he knew something Evan didn't want anyone to find out. I stood at the far edge of the crowd, half in the frame, half erased. The photographer called names, posed families, and arranged laughter. Every flash felt like a small explosion of belonging that missed me by inches. When he waved his hand for the Hale family, I took a step forward out of habit, then stopped when Evan's arm quietly blocked the space beside him. "Don't make this about you, Mother," he said through his perfect smile. The camera's strobe lit the bitterness in his eyes that his grin tried to hide. I could smell the faint fizz of champagne on his breath, the sweetness turning sharp as it mixed with resentment. Behind me, the lace on my gloves rasped against itself, dry, delicate, threatening to tear. Click. Another photo, another little fiction captured forever. I tried to look anywhere but at my son. Through the lens's glare, the world shimmered, too bright, like it might burn if I kept staring. For a moment, the crowd shifted, and I saw the reflection of my husband's wedding ring in a guest's glass. The sight tugged me back. 20 years earlier, a hospital room, the soft beeping and the promise he'd made me whisper, "Take care of our boy." When he died, I used every cent of his life insurance to send Evan to college. I'd told myself that was how love worked. You invest everything, and eventually it returns. But watching him now, preening under flashbulbs, I wasn't sure the return ever came. Then, soft arms slipped around my waist from behind. "Grandma," Ruthie whispered, her cheek warm against my shoulder. "Thank you for the dress." Her words landed lightly, but something inside me jolted. I hadn't given her the dress. I turned slightly, brushing a tear from her cheek. "What did you say, sweetheart?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from trembling. She smiled, small and trusting. "Dad said you paid for it, through the church." The orchestra struck a high, cheerful note, but all I could hear was the pulse in my ears. Through the shimmer of Tulin lights, I looked toward Father Benedict. He stood near the altar, hands folded, face composed into priestly calm, but his eyes flickered for just a heartbeat when they met mine. He knew something, and whatever it was, it had been meant to stay buried beneath all this lace and laughter. The photographer announced a quick break, and people scattered toward the buffet. Evan turned to the bartender, gesturing impatiently for a refill, his smile now gone. For a fleeting second, I thought maybe this was my chance to leave quietly, to spare Ruthie more embarrassment. But just as I gathered my purse, a waiter approached Evan with a folded paper. Evan opened it, skimmed, and laughed too loudly, pretending it was nothing. The paper crinkled as he tucked it into his jacket, but not before I saw the edge of it, a catering receipt stamped with a number I knew by heart, my own check number. The room seemed to tilt. I gripped the back of a chair to steady myself as the pieces began to form a terrible shape. I had given that check to the church, so why was it now paying for shrimp cocktails and table linens? Evan caught me watching. His grin stiffened, like glass about to crack. "Mother," he said again, quieter this time, "please, don't make a scene." But I wasn't the one making it. The scene was already written, and somewhere folded inside his pocket, my signature was paying for it. The waiter turned away, and the paper slipped slightly from Evan's pocket. I saw the faint imprint of Father Benedict's handwriting across the top, and realized the church and my son were connected by more than faith. The laughter and music from the reception faded as I wandered toward the side garden, desperate for quiet. The night air was cooler there, heavy with the smell of roses and cigar smoke drifting from the groomsmen gathered near the fountain. My shoes crunched over gravel as I circled the path, needing space to breathe after the suffocating smiles inside. That's when I saw it, something pale caught in the moonlight near the base of the fountain. A torn piece of paper fluttered against the stone, half soaked from the mist. I bent down and froze. It was half of a personal check, my own signature still visible across the bottom. 2 months earlier, I had written that check quietly in my kitchen, the night Father Benedict called about donations for community aid. He'd spoken gently, explaining how St. Mary's Benevolence Fund helped struggling families with medical bills and small weddings for parish members who couldn't afford them. I'd felt moved by the idea, grateful to still give even when my own means were limited. I made it out for $5,000 and mailed it the next morning without telling a soul. It had seemed like the right kind of anonymous goodness, the sort my husband would have been proud of. But now, under the moonlight, my name gleamed on a torn edge that read, "Pay to the Order of Benevolence Fund, Wedding Assistance." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The words pressed against my chest like a confession I hadn't meant to make. Wedding assistance. My hands shook as I pieced it together. The same fund, the same church, the same timing. My charity had been rerouted. My donation had paid for this wedding. Footsteps crunched behind me, and I turned to find Elaine Carter, the planner, standing there with her clipboard clutched against her chest. She looked nervous, glancing toward the hall before speaking. "He didn't pay the florist either, Mrs. Hale," she murmured. "Someone else covered it at the last minute." The garden seemed to tilt around me. "Who signed the transfers?" I asked, my voice thinner than I meant it to be. Elaine hesitated, shifting on her heels, then glanced toward the church. The answer was in her silence. Before I could press her further, the crunch of heavier footsteps approached from the path. I turned, and there was Father Benedict, moving slowly toward me under the string lights, the ivory envelope still in his hand. The same one from the altar, the same one marked final payment. And suddenly, the garden didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like a place where truths were about to bloom, whether I was ready or not. Father Benedict waited near the oak tree, his figure half lit by the string lights swaying above the garden. The air had turned heavier after sunset, carrying the faint echo of the organ drifting from the hall. When he called my name, I could hear something unusual in his tone, careful, almost fearful. I walked toward him, still clutching the torn check from the fountain. His hands trembled as he opened the ivory envelope I'd seen all day, the same one that had sat beside the chalice, then in his vest pocket, and now between us under the dark branches. He drew out several crisp cashier's checks, edges perfectly aligned, and held them out as if they might burn through his fingers. "There's $48,000 here," he said quietly. "All signed from M.H." My stomach tightened. The initials caught the moonlight like small knives. M.H., my name. My own handwriting, looping neatly in blue ink across every endorsement. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I remembered standing at my kitchen counter months ago, writing those checks as anonymous donations, for the church fund, for charity, for people in need. I'd believed in giving quietly, in doing good without recognition. What I hadn't realized was that every dollar had circled back into this wedding. The flowers, the food, the dress, the pride that had just humiliated me in front of 100 guests. The smell of wet earth filled the air as the sprinklers cooled the grass nearby. The paper edges felt smooth and cold against my fingers as I traced the first check. Father Benedict's eyes were wet when he finally met mine. "Evan knew," he said softly. He was aware of where the money came from, but he told everyone he paid for it himself. The words settled between us like ash. My throat felt dry, and for the first time all day, my anger found its shape. So my son, I whispered, used my giving to build his pride. Benedict didn't answer. He simply handed me one last slip, a printed receipt tucked inside the envelope. The heading read, Balance, Due, Priest Honorarium, Paid in Full. Before I could ask another question, a crash echoed from the hall, glass shattering, a table tipping over, and then Evan's voice, sharp and furious, tore through the night. "Where is my mother?" Evan came storming into the garden, his polished shoes grinding against the gravel as if every step were meant to leave a mark. From the ballroom windows, I saw faces peering out, curious guests frozen behind glass, watching a new scene unfold in what had already become their favorite drama. Evan straightened his jacket before speaking, voice syrupy smooth, his anger disguised as control. "Mother," he began, forcing a smile, "let's not ruin Ruthie's day." I stayed seated on the marble bench beneath the oak tree, its cold surface grounding me. "You already did," I said quietly. The sentence came out steadier than I expected, almost calm, like a verdict that had already been reached. The scent of champagne followed him, heavy and sharp, mingling with the faint violin tune drifting from the reception hall. For a moment, the music made everything feel almost normal, as if this were just another family misunderstanding that could be fixed with time. But there was nothing normal left between us, not since the moment I saw my name on those checks. Evan's eyes darted toward Father Benedict, who stood a few paces away, his hands folded behind his back. I noticed then that one of those hands wasn't still. It held a small phone, screen dim but recording. He wasn't looking for confrontation. He was looking for the truth. "You just had to make me look small," Evan said, his voice dropping to a hiss. The charm cracked, revealing the child still fighting for validation inside the man. I looked up at him, steady. "No, Evan," I said softly. "You did that yourself." For a flicker of a second, something shifted in his eyes. Remorse, maybe, or the faint echo of the boy I once tucked in at night. His shoulders sagged. "You'll get your money back," he murmured, and for a heartbeat, I believed him. It was a fragile, aching moment that felt almost like peace. Then he added with a smirk that killed whatever softness had tried to surface, "After I deduct the taxes your donation caused me." The air between us turned colder than the stone beneath me. Before I could answer, movement caught my eye. Ruthie stood at the garden's edge, her face pale, her bouquet trembling in her hands. She had heard every word. Ruthie's voice split through the garden like a bell cracked down the middle. "You made Grandma pay for my wedding?" she shouted, the edges of her words trembling but sharp enough to draw blood. Her makeup streaked down her face in thin black rivers, mascara tracing the collapse of her perfect day. Behind her, guests had begun to drift from the ballroom, pulled by the noise, their faces lit by the glow of phone screens already recording. The wind pushed through the trellis vines, carrying the sugary scent of frosting, and spilled champagne. The soft fabric of Ruthie's veil brushed my hand and clung there, the way children once clung to me after bad dreams. I wanted to tell her not to cry, not to let them see her break, but truth has a way of demanding tears before it gives peace. Evan stood rigid, his jaw tightening as every camera phone turned toward him. He looked at Ruthie, at me, then at Father Benedict, searching for control he no longer had. "She insisted," he said finally, his voice cracking just enough to sound human. "It was her idea. She wanted to help. She begged to." He reached for Ruthie's hand, but she pulled away. "Don't lie to me," she said, voice shaking. "You told everyone you paid for everything. You told me—" Her words caught like a sob on glass. "You said Grandma didn't have a dime to her name." Evan's face hardened, pride settling over fear like armor. "You think I'd take from her?" he said, gesturing wildly. "You've all lost your minds. I built this. Everything. You see, by myself." The guests began murmuring again, a low tide of disbelief and fascination. Someone whispered my name, Another muttered family money, and I felt the eyes of strangers peeling back layers of our private history. But I didn't move. I had learned in long years of discipline that sometimes silence holds more authority than any speech. Then Father Benedict stepped forward. His calm, measured tone cut through the chaos. "That's not true." Every head turned. Even the music from the hall seemed to fade, as if the instruments themselves leaned in to listen. He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small bundle of folded papers, the same pocket that had held the ivory envelope earlier. His hand trembled slightly as he unfolded them. "These," he said quietly, "belong to Mrs. Hale." Evan's face drained of color. "What are you doing?" he hissed. Benedict continued, unflinching. "Receipts, bank slips, letters from her account to the parish fund, redirected at your request." He laid them across the marble bench beside me, copies of every check I had written, every transfer I had made to the benevolence fund. Each one carried my name, my handwriting, my trust, and beside each the stamp that rerouted it into wedding assistance. I stared at them as if they were small ghosts come to testify. Ruthie covered her mouth, eyes wide, tears trembling on her lashes. "Grandma," she whispered, voice breaking. I reached for her hand, steadying it between both of mine. "It's all right, sweetheart," I said softly, though it wasn't. Truth hurts before it heals. Evan took a step closer to Father Benedict, fury flashing in his eyes. "You had no right," he said. "You can't just take my family's private records." Benedict met his glare with weary patience. "When lies harm others, they stop being private." A hush fell over the crowd. Somewhere a glass clinked as someone set it down too hard. Even the rose petals seemed to hold their breath. Then Evan lunged. He grabbed for the papers in Benedict's hands, his movement fast and clumsy, driven more by panic than plan. The priest staggered backward into the candle stand at the garden's edge. The iron frame tilted, candles toppling in slow motion, flame catching air. The world snapped into chaos. A gust of wind lifted the nearest candle cloth. The flame jumped, bright and hungry, straight to the hem of Ruthie's gown. Her scream split the air as white lace flared orange. Guests gasped, dropping their phones, rushing toward her. I didn't think. I tore off my shawl, throwing it around her waist, beating at the flames with bare hands. Father Benedict upended the nearest glass of wine onto the skirt, red liquid soaking through white silk. The scent of burned fabric and sweet alcohol filled the night, thick and dizzying. When the fire was finally out, the garden was silent except for Ruthie's sobs and the faint hiss of smoke. My shawl was ruined, my palms raw, but she was safe. Evan stood frozen, face pale, staring at the blackened edge of his daughter's dress. I looked at him, breathless, voice low but sharp as a verdict. "You nearly destroyed her too." And in the hush that followed, the faint wail of sirens began to echo in the distance. Someone had called the police. Ruthie turned toward me, eyes still wet, and whispered, "Grandma, what happens now?" The garden exploded into chaos. Guests screamed, chairs scraped, and someone dropped a tray of champagne that shattered like ice against the marble path. Ruthie's skirt was a whirl of fire, white lace turning orange, then black. Instinct took over. I ripped my shawl from my shoulders and threw it around her waist, pressing down with both hands. The fabric burned my palms, but I kept going, smothering flame with everything I had left in me. Father Benedict rushed forward, seizing the nearest thing in reach, a bottle of altar wine from the refreshment table. He poured it over the dress in one swift motion. The red liquid hissed as it met fire, a mixture of smoke, sweetness, and panic rising around us. Somewhere behind the crowd, the violin screeched out a single distorted note before silence swallowed the music completely. When the flames died, the scent of burnt lace filled the air, thick and acrid. My shawl clung wet and heavy to my hands, stained with wine and soot. Ruthie sobbed quietly, her veil torn, her eyes glassy with shock. Then a sharp crack. Father Benedict's phone had fallen in the chaos, screen split, but the recording was still running. I saw the last words frozen in the playback bar. Evan's voice saying, "You'll get your money back." Proof. A man in uniform, a guest, off-duty police officer, pushed through the crowd, checking Ruthie for burns and ushering people away from the smoldering bench. I looked toward the parking lot just in time to see Evan's figure slipping into the shadows, heading for his car. I bent to pick up the priest's phone, its broken glass glittering under the string lights. Ruthie's voice came trembling beside me. "He used you, Grandma." Before I could answer, a siren wailed somewhere beyond the gate. Someone had already called the police. Father Benedict's office was smaller than I expected. Walls lined with aging books, each one heavy with the weight of other people's confessions. The fluorescent light above us hummed softly, flickering every few seconds like it was nervous to witness what we were doing. The smell of old paper, candle wax, and faint incense clung to the air. On the desk between us lay a thin, leather-bound ledger, its edges worn smooth from years of careful hands. He opened it slowly, and the faint creak of the spine sounded like a sigh from the building itself. Neat rows of handwriting filled every page, donations, transfers, and notes. My name appeared 20 times, each followed by the same annotation. Redirected by a request of E. Hale. The room seemed to tighten around me. "He had access to these?" I asked, voice thin. Benedict nodded, sliding another folder forward. Inside were printed letters bearing my name, my signature, at least a version of it. The curves were almost perfect, but the pressure was wrong. My real handwriting had steadiness born of years of grading essays. This was forced, impatient. "He forged them," I whispered. Benedict rubbed his temples, guilt lining his face. "I feared scandal," he said quietly. "If I exposed him before the wedding, it would have destroyed Ruthie's day." "Then truth will come after it," I replied. My voice surprised even me, calm, certain, as if the years of keeping order in classrooms had finally found their purpose here. Elaine entered quietly, laying a small stack of papers on the desk. Unpaid vendor receipts, all marked covered by church transfer. The evidence was complete now, a paper trail no pride could hide. Before any of us could speak again, Benedict's phone buzzed. A single text glowed on the screen. "He's coming here!" The church doors slammed open with a force that rattled the stained glass windows. Moonlight cut through the aisle in a single silver blade, and Evan stood framed in it, his tie loosened, his face pale with fury. "You can't ruin me!" he shouted, his voice echoing off the stone walls until it sounded like an army of accusations. Father Benedict rose from behind the altar, calm but unflinching. The flicker of candlelight painted his face in gold and shadow. The air smelled of melted wax and cold marble, and every footstep Evan took rang sharp against the floor. "No one's trying to ruin you," Benedict said quietly. "You did that yourself. You stole from your mother, Evan." Evan's breath came uneven, his words tumoring over themselves. "I built a life. I made something out of nothing. You think any of you would have believed in me if I hadn't? You'd all rather see me beg." His voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment the anger slipped, leaving only fear. I stepped out from the shadows near the front pew, my heart pounding but steady. "You could have had everything, Evan," I said. "You just had to tell the truth." He looked at me, eyes glassy. "You wouldn't understand. You always needed to be the saint." Before I could answer, footsteps echoed from the back. Ruthie appeared in the doorway, her face still streaked with tears, an off-duty police officer by her side. In her trembling hands, she held a phone. "Dad," she said softly, "it's all recorded, everything you said in the garden." The fight drained from him instantly. His knees buckled and he sank to the cold marble floor, shaking. The officer stepped forward, voice firm but gentle. "Mr. Hale, you need to come with us." The next morning arrived too quietly for a day after ruin. The sky outside my kitchen window was the color of porcelain. The kind of pale calm that comes after a storm has already taken what it wanted. The newspaper sat folded beside my teacup, edges still damp from dew. Across the front page, bold black letters cut through the calm: "Wedding scandal, son accused of defrauding mother." My hands trembled as I reached for the cup, the soft clink of porcelain louder than it should have been. The smell of toast filled the air, comforting and ordinary, as if the world had decided to move on without asking me if I was ready. Sunlight slipped through the curtain, painting a slow gold line across the table. It was such a simple moment: tea, toast, sunlight, but after everything, it felt like mercy. I turned the paper over to avoid seeing Evan's face again. They had used his real estate headshot, the confident smile of a man who thought every deal would go his way. I traced his name with my fingertip, wondering how long it would take before I could look at it without that ache beneath my ribs. The phone rang softly. Ruthie. Her voice came through thick, tired, and trembling. "Grandma," she said, "I just read it." There was a pause, heavy with the kind of guilt that doesn't belong to the person who's speaking. "He's my father, but you're my home." Those words undid me. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I pressed the phone to my chest and let the silence say what words couldn't, that love sometimes survives the people who break it. When I finally found my voice, it was barely more than a whisper. "We'll get through this, Ruthie, one truth at a time." Not long after, there was a soft knock at my door. Elaine Carter stood outside, holding a small folder. Her usual professional calm was replaced by something gentler, almost maternal. She stepped inside and placed the folder on the table. "I thought you'd want these," she said. Inside were copies of the vendor receipts, the florist, the caterer, the dressmaker, each stamped "paid in full." My breath caught when I saw the note attached. "Anonymous transfer from the Parish Restoration Fund." Elaine smiled faintly. Father Benedict handled it himself, said it was the least he could do. For a moment, I couldn't move. Gratitude and sorrow tangled together until I couldn't tell one from the other. After everything that had burned, some small corner of decency still glowed quietly, refusing to go out. When Elaine left, I sat for a long time, tracing the edge of the receipts with my thumb. I thought about Evan, sitting in some holding cell, probably still insisting he'd been misunderstood. I thought about Ruthie, trying to balance forgiveness with disappointment. And I thought about Father Benedict, the man who had stood between truth and comfort, and finally chosen truth. As if summoned by the thought, there was another knock. This one is slower, deliberate. When I opened the door, Father Benedict stood there, hat in hand, his face lined with exhaustion. The morning light caught the silver in his hair, and for the first time, I noticed how much older he looked. "I won't stay long," he said softly, "but there's still one truth you deserve to know." His words hung between us like the still air before thunder. Whatever peace I had found that morning folded itself away. The world was about to tilt again, and I wasn't sure which direction it would fall. Father Benedict stepped into my small kitchen like a man walking into confession, shoulders slightly bowed under a weight that wasn't physical. He carried a plain brown folder pressed to his chest, the way one holds something both sacred and dangerous. The steam from my untouched tea curled between us, and I could tell by the quietness in his eyes that whatever he'd come to say would not undo what had already been broken, but it might explain why it had cracked in the first place. He gestured to the table, to the same spot where the morning paper still lay half-folded. "May I?" he asked. His voice was gentler now, stripped of the steady confidence it usually carried in the pulpit. When I nodded, he sat across from me and set the folder down carefully, sliding it toward me as though it might burn. On the tab was a handwritten label, "Original Donor Agreement." My heart gave a slow, tired thud. I reached out and ran my fingers along the edge before opening it. Inside were a handful of yellowing pages and one typed letter on Evan's old stationery, the kind he used when he first started his business. My name appeared in the greeting, neat and formal. "Dear Mother," followed by the kind of language you use when you want to sound professional, not personal. I began to read aloud. Thank you for investing the remaining balance of your care home savings. Once the business stabilizes, I'll return the full amount, with interest. The date at the top stopped me cold. It was from 11 years ago. My hands trembled as I lifted my eyes to Benedict. This was before he opened Hale Realty. He nodded slowly. Yes, you were his first investor. You trusted him, and when he told you he'd made it on his own, that was the first lie. The sound of paper rustling filled the silence. The faint scent of incense still clung to his clothes, mingling with the smell of black tea cooling on the table. My hand brushed against the smooth leather of the chair's arm, grounding me in something solid as the truth threatened to pull the floor away. So the money I thought I lost, I whispered, voice thin. He used it to start his company. Benedict's eyes softened. He did. And when the business grew, he still never repaid you. The first lie funded the last. The words hit me harder than I expected, but instead of anger, I felt something else, a hollow, aching release. The anger had already burned itself out at the wedding. This was the smoke that followed, curling through what was left of my faith in my son. I stared down at the letter again, tracing my name in his familiar handwriting. It was almost cruel, how polite he'd been in his deceit. There was no malice in the words, just ambition dressed as gratitude. Benedict leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. I found this while reviewing the parish archives. I didn't understand at first, but when you started donating through the benevolence fund, I realized what he'd done. He was using the same method again, only this time under the church's name. My throat tightened. You knew, I said softly. You knew before the wedding. He closed his eyes briefly. I suspected, but I wanted to believe he'd make it right before the ceremony. I thought if I gave him time, he'd find a way to tell you himself. I was wrong. I looked down at the folder between us, the proof of 2 betrayals neatly stacked inside, a decade apart, but built on the same foundation, the same trust. Outside, the church bell tolled noon, the sound muffled through the kitchen window. I wondered how many Sundays I'd sat beneath that bell, praying for Evan's success, never realizing that my prayers had already been answered with the wrong kind of prosperity. My eyes filled, but not from fury. It was the quiet grief that comes when you finally stop defending someone you love. The truth, harsh as it was, had given me something anger never could. Peace. Father Benedict's voice broke gently through the silence. Mrs. Hale, I am so deeply sorry. I thought sparing you the pain would be an act of mercy. I closed the folder, my fingers still trembling. Mercy? I repeated, not cruelly, but tiredly. Mercy is telling the truth before the fire starts. He bowed his head, and for a long time neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock and the creak of the chair when he finally stood. As he moved toward the door, I found my voice again, quiet but firm. Father Benedict, I said. He turned, his expression weary but waiting. Why did you help him hide it this long? The question hung in the still air, like a bell that hadn't finished ringing. And in his silence, I knew the next truth would hurt even more. Rain tapped softly against the kitchen window, slow and rhythmic, as though the heavens themselves had chosen to whisper instead of shout. The room smelled faintly of candle wax. The small votive Father Benedict had lit before we spoke. Its glow painted both our faces in flickering amber, the light catching in the creases of his brow. My old shawl rested over my shoulders, still warm from the dryer, its weight strangely comforting against the chill. He clasped his hands together, his fingers white at the knuckles. He begged me, he said finally, voice breaking on the edges. He came to me months ago, said you'd die if you knew, said the truth would kill you faster than his debt ever could. I stared at him for a long time, the sound of the rain filling the silence between us. I thought about Evan, not as a criminal, not even as a liar, but as a frightened boy who had once hidden broken toys under his bed, too afraid to admit they couldn't be fixed. It hurt to realize that even as a man, fear had remained his only faith. Father Benedict's eyes glistened. "I thought sparing you the shame would be an act of mercy," he said, "that by keeping his secret, I was protecting both of you." "Kindness without truth breeds rot," I answered quietly. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The words settled heavily between us. When love hides a lie, it turns holy men into accomplices. He nodded once, a man accepting his own sentence. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm resigning. I'll be submitting all the records to the diocese, every file, every statement. The truth will belong to the church now, not to me." We didn't speak after that. We just sat in silence, the candle sputtering low while the rain deepened outside. I bowed my head, and without asking, he did the same. We prayed, not for forgiveness, but for peace. A sudden knock startled us both. The door creaked open just enough for Ruthie's tearful face to appear. "Grandma," she whispered, breathless, "the reporters want your statement." And just like that, the quiet sanctity of confession gave way to the noise of the world waiting to hear my version of the truth. The community hall smelled of brewed coffee and nerves. Reporters filled every seat, camera lenses glinting like a constellation of small, unblinking eyes. The hum of whispered speculation hung in the air, punctuated by the staccato rhythm of flashbulbs. I stood behind a long wooden table draped in white cloth, the same kind the church used for parish announcements, but today it felt more like a witness stand. Ruthie stood beside me, her hand steady on mine. The warmth of her touch grounded me amid the chaos. She hadn't left my side since the night Evan was arrested, and I could feel in her grip both guilt and resolve, the strange combination that comes when love and disappointment share the same heart. I looked down at the statement in front of me, my words trembling faintly in the print. The microphones leaned forward like impatient listeners. I took a breath and began. "I gave what I had in love," I said slowly, the coarse mesh of the microphone brushing my thumb as I steadied my grip. "It was misused, but not wasted. The lesson it taught us is worth more than the money ever was." A few camera shutters clicked. Somewhere in the back, someone whispered, "Brave." I wasn't sure if it was bravery or just the exhaustion that comes after surviving humiliation. Still, I continued. "I've established the Hale Integrity Fund," I announced, my voice growing stronger. "It will provide aid to elders who've been defrauded or manipulated by family members. No one should ever feel ashamed for trusting too much." There was a brief murmur among the crowd as I glanced toward the front row, where Father Benedict sat quietly, hands folded, eyes lowered. The fund's initial balance, restored from court restitution and small donations from strangers, was proof that even broken trust can build something whole. When I finished, the applause was soft but real. Not celebration, acknowledgement. As I stepped back from the podium, a young reporter approached, placing an envelope on the table. The handwriting on it stopped me cold. Evan Hale, my son's hand, unmistakable. Across the front, just 2 words. "I'm sorry, Mother." The flashes popped again, but this time I didn't flinch. I simply laid my hand over the letter, feeling the weight of forgiveness before I even opened it. It was months later when Ruthie and her husband Daniel came to visit my new apartment, smaller than the old house, but filled with light. The place smelled of cinnamon rolls baking in the oven, a comfort I'd learned to make again after years of losing my appetite to worry. The clock on the wall ticked softly, slow and patient, like time itself had decided to give me grace. Ruthie moved easily through the space, humming as she set a small bouquet of daisies on the kitchen counter. She wore her wedding band now, without the guilt that had once shadowed her eyes. Daniel carried a box of framed photos, insisting he wanted to help Grandma decorate, though the walls already held more memory than space. She glanced toward the frame above my writing desk, the one that held the note Father Benedict had given me before he left town. Inside the same ivory envelope that had once carried forged payments and guilt, there was only a single line, handwritten in calm, steady script. Love never invoices itself. I'd had it framed in gold and hung it above my desk. Every morning when the light hit it, the words seemed to breathe a little. Ruthie stood in front of it now, arms crossed, smiling softly. "You know, Grandma," she said, "that day, it wasn't ruined, it was reborn." I turned from the stove, wiping my hands on a towel. "Reborn?" I repeated, half smiling. She nodded. "The truth came out, and it hurt, but it set us free. I thought our family fell apart that night, but maybe it was just being rebuilt the right way." Her words carried more wisdom than her age should have allowed. I looked at her, truly looked, and saw not the frightened bride from that day, but a woman who had learned that love could survive fire. I poured her tea, the steam curling between us like a quiet bridge. "You're right," I said. "I thought I was paying for a wedding, but I was really paying for peace, and that's worth every cent." Daniel raised his cup. "To peace," he said softly. "To truth," Ruthie added. I smiled, feeling the warmth of their voices fill the small room. "And to grace," I said, "because without it, we're just people keeping score." The clock ticked again. The cinnamon rolls finished baking, golden and sweet, their scent filling every corner. I thought about everything those months had taken from me: money, pride, illusions, and what they'd given in return: dignity, truth, and a kind of forgiveness I didn't know I was capable of. The world outside the window was quiet, the sun steady on the sill. I closed my eyes and whispered a silent thank you, not for what I'd lost, but for the strength to live beyond it. When I opened them, Ruthie was looking at me with the same softness her mother once had, and I realized that healing doesn't always come as thunder. Sometimes it arrives like sunlight through thin curtains, quiet, patient, unstoppable. I looked at the framed note one more time and said, mostly to myself, "That's how I paid, and how I was repaid." The truth had cost me everything, but it also gave me back myself. And if this story touched your heart, even a little, take a deep breath and imagine what you would have done if grace cost you everything. Would you still give it? If you felt something in this journey, the pain, the strength, or the quiet redemption, please like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story that dives deep behind the moments we never talk about. Every click keeps these true human stories alive. And together, we can keep finding the light that hides behind minds.